Yes, enlightenment is the perfect knowledge of the nature of reality, which the name Buddha, which is not a personal name, it means someone who is awakened and who has become functionally omniscient, actually, from the Buddhist point of view. Therefore, the ultimate scientist who actually understands reality is the Buddhist theory. But then, in a lovely way, the Buddha then said to people, don't believe what I say, and don't believe that I'm a Buddha necessarily. But when I give you some possible thing you can do with yourself to improve your understanding and your feeling of lessen your suffering and so forth, if it begins to work for you, then you can give me some credibility. And then at some stage, if it's working a lot for you, you can perhaps entertain the idea that it's possible to become completely enlightened and completely awakened yourself. And that's gives you therefore a very important goal to seek as like the fruition of evolution, is to become a fully enlightened being. And fully enlightened doesn't just mean wise and knowing, it also means loving and compassionate. And why is that? Because when you know the nature of the world, you realize there is no difference between yourself and other beings. In fact, you have the inconceivable experience of being all the other beings as well as yourself. And therefore, and you also experience that as yourself and them being made of bliss. You feel extremely blissful when you realize that, apparently. I'm still hoping. And you see the others as made of bliss also, that their basic constituency, their strong force in their own sort of atoms, molecules, their forms, whatever you want to call it, is bliss. And then you realize that they, on the other hand, you don't ignore the fact that they perceive themselves as all struggling and fighting off the world and afraid of it and really having a terrible time. And of course, human is relatively okay. The lower animal forms, the hellish forms, what's called pretas, they're very, very worse suffering there are than human beings. And so then you automatically have compassion in the way that one has compassion for their own hand. You can say that when you put your hand on a hot pot, you want to soothe that burn immediately, and that's being compassionate to your hand. But in a way, we don't call it that because it just seems natural. So enlightenment is defined, therefore, as a wisdom of knowing by being everything, infinite sensitivity, and then compassion and love by wishing the happiness of all those other sensitivities, out of having experienced yourself that happiness. So that's what Buddhahood is defined as. And that's what Buddha was seeking. Therefore, Buddha's great discovery, Buddhism has been very misunderstood both in India and China and the West, not just in the West. Because his Four Noble Truths is like a doctor's diagnosis. You know, suffering is a symptom of a cause which is a malfunction, a distortion, known as misknowledge or misunderstanding or ignorance. But that there is a medicine for that, which is wisdom, and that leads to nirvana or cessation of the suffering. Not cessation of life, but cessation of the suffering. And that nirodha is the prognosis. And that's his real discovery, that there is such a prognosis. It was not at all certain in ancient time, or even today, that there is actually a true freedom from suffering. Except, maybe pie in the sky later, or maybe God's free of it and you join with God in theistic religions, etc. But the idea that you can be free of suffering in your life as a human, and then permanently so, and without leaving life, that's not an obvious thing, and that is kind of a proclamation of Buddha's. And in his time, there were others who spoke of liberation and release, but actually most of them thought of it as an escape from the world, complete leaving to another place. They thought of, and Buddha allowed people to think of nirvana as another place too. Some kind of people who would have been overwhelming to them to be told that the way they are right here and now is nirvana. Because then they would have thought, well, then who needs it? I'm still suffering. And or they would have thought, well, then I can just do whatever I feel like because it's all fine. So they would have confused non-dualism, in other words, with a kind of monism, one or another type of monism, which would not have been helpful. So he allowed people, some of them, to feel that there was a place apart from the world that was free of suffering. But he really, his real teaching, when he criticized his own teaching of that to people more advanced, and he said, it's right here. You have to understand in such a way that you have the nirvana, and yet you're there with other people, and you're there able, therefore, to help them. In other words, no wisdom solution without the automatic compassion engagement type of thing. So that's sort of what it's about, I think. Then the path, of course, then the path, the fourth noble truth is the path, and the path is the way to reach, is the medicine or the therapy. You follow the medical diagnosis idea, So you have symptom, diagnosis of the cause, prognosis of the state of being healed, and then the path of how to get to that state of being healed. And I would say about that path, people talk of it as, Buddhists too, as the three trainings. They talk like training, because of a kind of anti-intellectual thing that we have in our minds, because of the backwardness of our educational culture in the West. But the word is shiksha, adi shiksha means a kind of higher education, actually. Shiksha means education, not training. Training is just something you do by repeating, and then you sort of do it by habit. But education is where you bring out your own inner knowledge and your own inner intuition and your own inner sense of freedom and happiness and bliss. And so that is what those are, the three educations: an ethical education, a meditational or mental education, psychological education, and most important, a wisdom education, which is a scientific education, actually.